Welcome, everyone, to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and on this podcast, I take a deep dive into the writing process behind some of the world's best songwriters. By way of background, I am a former English professor. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So this is a conversation about writing between two writers. My goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat prose writers, just as writers, plain and simple. So that's all we focus on. I don't care about tour stories, favorite bands, how bands get their name, favorite foods, anything like that. This is, again, a deep dive into the songwriting process with some of the world's best songwriters. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the pod, it is Jena Malone. Malone has a new album out called Flowers for Men. It is fantastic. You, of course, know Malone. You should know her from her role in The Hunger Games, many movies, many TV shows. She's set to star in a new series by the Duffer Brothers of Stranger Things called The Burrows. But I've been interviewing quite a few songwriters who were also actors. Malone, for one, just had Maya Hawke on, Sasha Spielberg, the Wolf Brothers. Several years ago, interviewed Kevin Bacon, Jeff Daniels. And what I find, and Malone really stresses this, is the emphasis on language, because they are actors and obviously deal with words. And there's an intense focus, probably more so than normal, on language and words and how they sound and the meaning in the songs. And I love that about this discussion. All that being said, she had me when she mentioned Edna St. Vincent Millay, the poet. We went deep into poetry here, and any songwriter who mentions the classics and talks about the influence that poetry has in them, I just swoon over. We went deep into that also. She's also a parent. Malona is also a parent, and a lot of people I think don't understand, if you're not a parent, if you don't have kids, the role that being a parent plays practically on being a songwriter. The time limits the time that you have to do those things, and it influences what you write about. And so we went deep into that as well. And also, you got to listen to her talk about why one of her favorite places to write is in the back of an Uber. Never heard that before. Again, Jena Malone's new album is called Flowers for Men. Here is my interview with Jena Malone.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you do. It's so funny how songwriters kind of get left out of the mix so often, but sort of for me, it's such an everyman's entry point into prose and poetry and nonlinear storytelling. I know for me growing up as a kid, I think some of the first songwriters that really like killed me were like Tom Waits and Neil Young, and it was really their words. It was sort of like I was just as hungry for like the Leonard Cohens and the Tom Waits to dissect and to look and find the little lyric books and than I really was for poetry at that age. And that was more like 14, 15. And that what's so interesting is that that's sort of what propelled me into wanting to read more poetry and propelled me into wanting to read more. And so I think that music has such a cool capacity to reach, the hearts and ears everywhere, more so than books, particularly in this day and age.
It's funny because I actually started the site before it was called Songwriters on Process. It was called Writers on Process. And I interviewed songwriters, poets, playwrights, novelists, like all types of writers. I had this idea that I would interview all of these different genres. And the songwriters were always, they were the most open with talking about their process. It was really hard to get novelists and poets and that type to talk about their process.
Oh, that's so
So
interesting. Why do you think
yeah,
that was?
I don't know, but I don't know why, but maybe because it's such a part. I think part of it is because no one asks songwriters.
Right.
So
They're
I
hungry for
just,
the conversation.
yeah. Um, so, and at that point, I just said, well, I'll just interview songwriters. And so I think it's gone well because, as you said, like a lot of them just feel like, wow, no one asks us these questions. So, um, So actually, let's start. I normally end with talking about writing or
Okay,
other types
sorry.
of
Sorry if I
writers.
jumped the gun. I was just
N-
excited. I love
No,
what you do.
no, thank you. And let's get into it right now. I mean, because you mentioned poetry, and I will tell you that I could probably count on one hand the number of songwriters who read poetry. And it's
Really?
deep,
But they're so complimentary.
very, very, very few. Um, And I don't know why, and you don't have to convince me, obviously, I feel like it's natural. I mean, if you're a lover of language and how words sound independent of music, all that kind of stuff, it seems to be a natural. So tell me, why do you think it's important for well, maybe let's start with who do you like to read, and then talk about why do you think it's important, to read poetry?
Um, gosh, I mean, it's that's a giant question. So I think I was really fortunate. I got to do I did public, private, and then homeschooling because I started acting when I was very tiny. And in my public school journey, I was not introduced to poetry at all. So the poetry that I read or rather listened to was music. It was Sir Mix-a-Lot, it was Madonna, it was Prince, it was Michael Jackson. And so for me that is poetry because it's like anything that's sort of a moving, rhythmic, word-based. It doesn't have to run, it doesn't have to have any of the qualifications, but it's a story that has rhythm. um and then I had an amazing tutor when I was on sets that was really like, okay, I see you. I know what you, because I used to doodle. I doodled a lot and I did my own little, I would write poems, as every 11 or 12-year-old girl does, in some ways. And so my tutor was like, okay, E. Cummings, Emily Dickinson. And then I went on this whole journey of like reading a lot of Leonard Cohen and who's the guy that wrote, and my brain is just I'm super on mom brain. There's an author, there's a poet that's also a playwright, that's also a novelist. He did Xerox Candy Bar is one of his best. Anyways, I'll remember it. But it was really like Emily Dickinson and E. Cummings. And then I kind of discovered more women in the world. With oh my god, in my brain, I should have written them all down. Two candles burning. Oh my god, why am I forgetting all of my names?
I'm gonna have to figure it out now.
Here we go. Oh, Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Oh, yeah, of
Um,
course.
and she also did a lot of prose and poetry and sonnets and plays, and she did kids stories. And I just, I love that it was all invited, like there was no like I only perform in this corner. And then of course Mary Oliver, and I think Tom Robbins. When I would read him as a novelist, I would often just savor some of his sentences like they were poems. But yeah, so those are some of my favorites.
So can you carry those lessons? What kind of lessons do you take away from that, when you write songs? Because obviously poetry is different because there's a music attached to it, but are there some lessons you can still take away from it to make you a better songwriter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that being so obsessed with Tom Waits and Bob Dylan and Neil Young and PJ Harvey and Nina Simone when I was a teenager, like I kind of refused to listen to any modern music at that age. And it really invited me in to this stage of risk to create stories and narratives and really push this, like, I'm going to start the song here. I'm going to paint this wild picture, and it's going to end in a completely different space, and you're going to feel like you've traversed something with me. And so I feel like that's kind of my where I've always wanted to hit. And so even if I don't hit it, I'm always kind of wanting to go into that more folk mentality of like, let's tell a ballad, let's tell a story here. I also really appreciated how, Nina Simone did a lot of freestyle and improvisation in her work. Particularly, she was an incredible composer, right? I loved when she would take someone else's song and just completely upend it. And I feel like poetry has such an ask for songs to upend it, you know? And so I feel like a lot of the writing that I do, sometimes I can't tell if it's a poem or a song, but rather the ones that ask me to upend it, speak it out, move it around, see if there's an expansion there. And then some poems, like they refuse to be sung, they refuse to be changed. Like they're so firm and kind of, they tend to be for me the ones that are more like violent and visceral. They need nothing, Um,
How about novelists? Do you get what novelists and more long form writers are you a fan of?
um, I mean, I'll be honest. I really have not read that many novels since I became a mother. I feel like it's just like parenthood just changes everything. I mean, I'm barely getting through a season of something, I'm just starting to bring back in the practice of like, I want to read novels, I miss them. But I feel like I've been in educational, like my tongue's been craving instruction more, So I've been reading more things about politics and biographies, and I'm really fascinated with letters. I find that that's a real dying process. And so, even there's a really interesting book on the painter. She's from New Mexico. Um, oh my God, what's her name? Anyways, like all of these amazing letters to different people in her life. And then I went crazy and I bought all of these books on different people's letters. I haven't started it yet, but I put it right next to my typewriter because I'm trying to sort of like, jumpstart that, like, let's just let people know how you feel in such a different way, because I think that we communicate differently depending on the style, right? Like you're going to text in a different way. You're going to write longhand letters in a different way. You're going to have a conversation in person in a different way. And even in Zoom, it's a different kind of conversation?
So you said typewriter. S-
Hmm.
Uh, so are you when it comes to you use the typewriter? When it comes to lyrics, are you a typewriter person, pen and paper person? How do you normally write?
I'm a pen and paper person and I'm a scribble on my notes. I think that whatever is available, I really do like, I'm always carrying journals around. I have boxes of journals from when I was tiny just to keep, who knows what I'm going to do, who knows what one does with those things. But it's sort of nice to see, physical archives of thought and process. Typewriters I find are more in the editing phase, like when I already have the poems or songs crafted and I want to sort of make it look nice, I don't find that I think very well on a typewriter, like I think that I make a lot of mistakes. So I'd rather make those mistakes longhand or on my phone, because just those are the formats that I feel like I can write really fast and make mistakes that have flexibility of being able to still read them later.
So I'm going to get very specific with this. So because songwriters are very particular about color of ink, brand of pen, type of
Oh.
paper. Oh yeah. So is that important to you at all?
I mean, once you start writing in a certain pen, I have a very hard time choosing a new one, but I don't have color preferences. I actually prefer the randomness of the pen because I think sometimes red ink brings out different energy, than like a blue one. I don't really like writing with pencils. And I mean, unfortunately, I feel like since 28 to now, it's been so much of writing on my phone that it's really like my notes apps have just become my archive. Um, So yeah, I don't have as many pen preferences, but I do find it really hard. Like once something starts in blue ink, it has to finish, you know?
So Hoff, I people tell me they have thousands of entries, in the notes app. Uh, so how often do you go back to those ideas in your notes app to kind of refresh or maybe think about, that's maybe a good idea to write about?
Often. Often, yeah. I even like to print them out and to be able to look at them from a different format, print them, rearrange them. Sometimes I'll just do search with words, because say I'm writing a song and there's like a tone of like maybe I'm like maybe lace is going to happen in this space, so I'll just type lace in my search of notes, and all the times I've referenced it in any of the writings or poems will come up, and I'll be like, "Oh, I remember writing something 10 years ago about a woman who had died and the lace that was left behind." So in that way, I find it's like creating your own little AI box, where it's like you have your own digital archive of your own writings and even just turns of phrases. And it's so funny. I feel like once you love the written word and getting to express in that format, nothing is too small or too big, even if it's just remembering certain words or two words that go together or a certain sentence. I've never really been stuck on it needs to be a certain length or format. Um, I feel like maybe also because I was never taught or studied in that space. So free form is really the expression I know best.
Have you ever thought about, does the content ever change? Because I could see that maybe you could be in a different emotional space when you're writing with pen and paper versus typewriter versus phone. Do you ever find that unconsciously the subject matter changes based on how you're writing, what you're writing with?
I think I think for some reason for me pen and paper has a more lucid quality that I tend to just allow and I don't edit. I just keep working through and just keep pushing and then maybe I'll start the whole thing again. Whereas I think in a digital space on an iPhone or in the Notes app, it feels like I like to be more I'll take my time. It's a slower practice, but no, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's more environmental. Like I think like I write specific things on trains more than, or like planes. Like when I'm traveling, something always comes out. Um or my sort of middle of the night. I remember there was this whole phase where I was just starting to pick up the pen again in my sort of breastfeeding journey. Um, and I would just go crawl into the closet, like turn on a little light and just sort of furiously, like on the ground, like whatever it was. Um, and I felt like those were much more confessional, sort of a lot of blood in them, because it felt like a very secret space in some ways.
Well, I want to talk about the world of motion because I talk about that with songwriters a lot and just writers in general. I mean, but I think there's different kinds of motion. There's the, I guess, self locomotion, which is the ideas we get while we're walking,
Mm,
biking, running, something like that. And then there's the ideas we get when someone else is moving us, planes, trains, things like that. Have you ever thought about the difference? Because motion's pretty common. I mean, every songwriter and writer, talks about they get ideas in those places. But I,
mm,
I, I wonder if there's a difference between if you're walking around the neighborhood versus if you're in a train, if that content ever changes.
that's such a good question. I don't know. I feel like that's a question that only through examination of previous content could really, like answer properly. I think because for me, songwriting, if it does come to me as a song and not a poem or just an idea that needs to be written down, I can carry it with me through melody. It's instantly, there's not as big of a need to write it down instantly. It's sort of like I can work on it in melody with my voice. And I feel like those are things that come to me more like in a walking or in the tub or when you don't have pens. And so it's sort of, I feel like melodies come more to me in those spaces. And when I'm in a space where someone is doing the transporting, that's when the full structure of the narrative song emerges.
I would imagine also when you're on a plane 30,000 feet up or you're on a train and you're seeing the countryside, I'd imagine that the themes tend to be much more existential, rather than walking through the neighborhood, maybe. Um,
Yeah, you would think, but I also think that it's such an ancient, like, we carry so many ancient stories of migration in us that I think sometimes that leaving a space, it helps us tap into some of those sort of, hidden, mystical, genetic, wound spaces, of thousands of years of migration. And so I think that sometimes it can feel very personal, it's sort of that I, which is built on, 1,000 years of other eyes.
Now the other area that talking about movement and the I always quote the one quote I always give songwriters is the Agatha Christie, the writer Agatha Christie said the best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes. So
Mm.
the idea that when our brains are engaged in unconscious activities, and I've heard things from gardening to folding laundry to vacuuming. When your brains are engaged in activities that require no conscious thought, that's when the unconscious bubbles up. I get a lot of ideas in those repetitive motions,
What's your
movements.
favorite?
That's a good question. Independent of exercise. I think that I get most of my ideas when I'm on walks, no question. And I find that walking cures writer's block, ruts, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Around the house, that's let me think, because we do delegate chores, pretty well in the house.
Mhm.
Um, I'd say probably doing the dishes. I hate to say sound like Agatha Christie, but I feel like doing the dishes or something like that. Maybe cooking also.
Mhm.
Um, when you're cooking something that doesn't require a lot of thought, maybe that too. Um, but I don't get them. I've heard things like cleaning, folding laundry, things like that. I don't get in that space as much. I would say probably when I'm doing something in the kitchen, cutting, chopping vegetables or something like that. But independent of that, walking, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know. Do you have kids?
So that we have 4 kids.
Okay.
So that's I was always also gonna ask you because 'cause you're a mother, and do you find that I found that having kids has made me a much more efficient writer because I have
Mm.
less time. That once our kids are older, but when they were in the nap phase, it's, she's going down for a nap. I've got 2 hours. Whereas before kids, it was, oh, I want to relax. Now it's, I only have 2 hours. So I found ironically that having those deadlines, that rigid schedule makes me much more productive. So I was going to ask you that anyway, but I'm curious. Do you find that being a mother has made you ironically more productive?
No. I mean, I think it's made my ability to multitask exponentially higher. But I think it's also I'm a recovering grind culture. I was raised in the 80s and the 90s, and I feel like, in the grind culture aesthetic always wears this sort of perfectionism wound. And so I just feel like becoming a parent gave me it was a really beautiful offering of asking, or rather invitation to be like, you're gonna have to reframe productivity. You're gonna have to just burn the entire language of what you know about it down to the ground, so that in turn what emerges and what I learn to love is what's real. And so I don't think that I am better at writing or more efficient. I do know that I was thinking about doing the dishes and the laundry, and I find that even that is a multitask because it's like when I'm doing the dishes, I'm also answering questions and thinking about the day. And so I don't, my, of invisible labor of parenting still is happening whilst doing those activities. But as soon as my son goes to his dad, the waking up in the morning, 100,000 ideas. Just putting my shoes on, I get distracted by an idea. Making coffee is like the most infinite richness because my invisible labor finally sets itself down, And so I think what motherhood or parenthood gifted me was that when I am alone, it's a cacophony of riches. Whereas I was always, pre-children, or child rather, um, it would be like I would go to my favorite place to write, or I would go and smoke pot in the forest, or, like I would kind of arrange moments. Whereas now, as soon as I have alone time and real alone time, a whole inner symphony emerges, sort of patient, awaiting, and that feels really beautiful. I have a hard time oscillating between mom brain and creative brain just because of the invisible labor of being a parent. I just I also love it. I love the multitask. I love I find it wildly creative, of like running a household and dinner and homework, and it's all this spontaneous um potentialities for growth and connection and poetry and sharing. And so I do really kind of get off or find creative meat on the bone of being in that domestic setting. Um, I just don't often get time to write it down. So that's also why I think I'm more of a songwriter now than I'm a writer as a parent, because of voice notes. So I now can live in a whole world where I don't have time to sit and write and be like, okay, I got this idea. I can sit there and just freestyle or walk through something, and it feels like a very similar expression. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I think more songs come to me now as a parent than they did when I was just a solo human.
I've got a quote up here. I write down, I always take down quotes from writers. And one of my favorite quotes, I just heard this recently, was Conan O'Brien. And
Uh-huh.
someone was asking Conan about writing. And he said, I wrote this down. He said, a lot of writing is sitting and thinking and eating donuts.
Uh-huh.
And but I love that because I would always tell my students that the writing process is always taking place. So I think that's what you're talking about, right? It's writing is happening when we're not writing.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing to think about as a writer, to lessen the anxiety of I am creating right now. I may not know that I am, but I am. And that's why
Mhm.
his quote it sounds so silly, but
Yeah.
that idea that writing happens when we're not writing. And I think that's what you're kind of telling me there, right? That in all that chaos, there's still a lot going on.
Yeah, and stories are being formed, and connections, and, I feel like I always feel like the most important work that you'll do, you're never going to get paid for. It's not it's all the preamble, it's all the life living, and then the getting to tell about it. It's really hard to get to tell about it if you're not living in a way that feels very full and rich, and, in awe. You definitely need a little bit of awe to be able to want to pick up a pen.
All right. So when you pick up the pen, is there a time of day, to the extent that you can, time
Mhm,
of day, room? I'm fascinated by the ritual of the
mhm,
writer. And as a matter of fact, there was a book that is coming out. I just read about it in the New Yorker.
mhm.
And I think it gets released in a couple of weeks. I think it's called the Writers Room, and it's I forgot the woman's name, but she talks about the writing spaces of the famous writers like Emily Dickinson and kind of that ritual. And we'd like to think that, oh, we have this amazing space where, I'm going to create this perfect space to do my writing, but it never ends up that way. So I'd just love to know if you have a space like that or a time of day, things you have to have rich with you. How important is that ritual when it comes to sitting down to write?
Yeah, it's so funny. We're so romantic about writing, and I really think it's just one of the sweetest parts of humanity, or like humans, and that we sort of just think that it's this whole thing. And I've always had like a little writing desk in my room somewhere, or in my house somewhere, whether it be in an office or a living room or in my bedroom. But I never write at it. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
just it's like food for thought, Like, I don't actually eat it. Um, I find that for me, when an idea, or, you get those sort of strikes, those sort of reckonings, those, spells, I'll it doesn't matter where I am, right? I'll be leaning in a corner at a subway stop, or I'll be sitting on the floor cleaning up something, or if I have the capacity to write it down, I will, and I may stay in that space for an hour. Um, it Unfortunately, I'm not very good at sort of, I have 2 hours, I'm gonna go sit at my desk. But what's weird is that I actually think that if I was to like, write what exactly I need, I would get in an Uber. I love, for whatever reason, someone else driving and me not worrying. I would go get in an Uber that would take me an hour away. And I would just sit in the back seat with my headphones on, no one talk to me, and I would just write and write and write. For whatever reason, it's one of my favorite spaces for writing, is being driven, which is so weird. It's like, like, who knows
How
what
did you discover that?
I think just I think there's a world where, as an actor, you often have drivers, and they take you to location, and then you leave set, and I'm very used to the idea of, at the end of a workday, getting in the car and needing to sit in the back seat and work through the material of the next day. So it's sort of like this makeshift office space, because sometimes it's 45 minutes to a location, or sometimes it's 2 hours, and I think since a very young age, I developed this practice of, as soon as I'm in a car and I have a long ride, I tuck into the back, and I'm like, what do I need to work on? But yeah, that's just, I mean, I don't often get to be like taking random Ubers for an hour, but when I know I'm doing it, I'm so happy. And I preface it by being like, I'm going to write for a bit. I'm going to have my headphones on, like, I don't want to be rude, but I'm just like, I'm a single parent. This is my only time. And then they're usually very, kind. But
So you can write song in those spaces too. And I mean, that's what you're telling me in the back of an Uber.
oh yeah, I mean, it's
Amazing.
writing, it's singing. I mean, I've given some of my most favorite intimate performances in the back of a cab, of just like figuring out songs, and sometimes incorporating the driver, sometimes, asking the driver, I'll be stuck, or I'm just interested, and I'll ask them, something about their life, or if they had 3 words, or what was the last 3 things they bought that day, and just to kind of spark, because I love spontaneity. I find that it really loosens me up as a writer. And then I'll just kind of make up a freestyle based on their story, or what they bought, or what they tell me. And it brings like a celebration to the moment. It feels like church in a way.
That's amazing. I've never heard that before. But I love that
If you
idea.
record it, you have it. So then you can pull back and be like, gosh, I remember there was a couple things that happened in that one little freestyle in the back of a taxi cab. And sometimes it's a song, and sometimes it's a poem, and sometimes it's just enough to want to write it down and not be too worried about where she will end up.
So independent of the Uber, have you ever been a right through the night type of person?
I definitely was a night owl before I became a parent, for sure, and I think the sweet spot was that sort of, like, 1 to 3 space, you know?
I hear that a lot, and I read recently that they said that, that's genetic, whether you're a night owl or a morning person, that we just can't no matter how hard we try, we're pre-wired for one of those, and we can't be the other one. But I could never ever never pulled an all-nighter in college. Could never do it. I could see the appeal of that kind of, the world is
Curious,
quiet.
yeah.
I could get up no problem at super early and write to because people are still asleep, and so that's my quiet space, but I could never do the all-night stuff.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
all-nighters is crazy. I think the idea of having to do, like, homework or assignments in that space, I've never done that. That's not I mean, I also never went to college in that way, so, that I can only use those very holy hours, happily if it's more, like, personal, creative, exploratory. I can't sleep because it's so wonderful, you know? I think that kind of gun to the head, like, has to be done by 7 in the morning. I don't know. That's just not as fun. It's more fun now. It's funny, as a parent, I'm like, "Give me homework. Give me an
right,
assignment,"
right,
you know?
right.
All I want is a deadline. It's so funny.
I wanna talk about the new album because I love it. And I was listening to it, and I just don't hear many things like that. That it was just so like, it really took it takes a deliberate listen, and I mean that in a good way, right? Not that's it's not music that you can just, like, have on. I think the music that you really have to sit there with your headphones and really kind of really focus intently on. Um, so my question is, what kind of emotional space are you in when you're writing songs like that? Is there an ideal emotion when you're most productive, when you were writing those songs?
I don't know. I think I never love the word ideal because it adds that sort of expectation which creates a disappointment, you know? I like to think of it as a palette, and what's complementary to a palette. I think sometimes if you arrive at the microphone with grief, I think it's very easy to sort of build a palette within that, of awe, gratitude, processing, rage, forgotten love. I think that there's each new reason to want to sing a song will create its own palette, Um, I think this album, I think there was a lot of me stepping into wanting to reclaim spaces that were forgotten to me. Also wanting to sort of retell stories that um, that potentially, how we tell stories in our brain of like you're not good enough, or like sort of wanting to sort of reclaim some of my inner child's myths, to sort of retell those stories, to celebrate them. um I think there was a lot of emotion of sort of longing, like this sort of longing for and not quite being satisfied with the type of love that maybe society had um, gifted me a language of, or movies had gifted me language of, and that I was in a space of wanting to create a new language around relational love. And um, yeah, so I feel like those were some of the spaces I stepped into.
It's funny because you mentioned grief, and I have this conversation with writers all the time, but why is it that we rarely write from a space of euphoria? I don't know why that is, and I that's a far
You
too
may
deep of
know.
a
I'm sure you
discussion.
have some hunches, right? I have a hunch. I feel like, because it's so consistent, right? It's so goddamn accurate that, it's got to have a science behind it.
So okay, all right, let's try to figure this out. Because I think when you're in a space of euphoria, you want to enjoy that moment for what it is and feel the euphoria. But maybe when you're in a space of grief, you want to write your way out of it.
Mm.
I've just never heard any writer say, "Yeah, I get the most done when I'm feeling the happiest, which ironically is when you should, right? When you feel like you're in that mood. But I don't know any writer who said euphoria, happiness is a great place to write from. Um, but if someone said to me, it's because you just want to enjoy the moment. I don't want to be writing when I'm having fun. Maybe it's not as maybe that's as simple as it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I experienced the exact same thing, you know, like just having these really beautiful dry spells of when I'm really creatively and emotionally satisfied in my world, you know. I don't often reach for the pen, but I think the pen is a really simple tool of alchemy, you know, and I think that when we receive pure joy or happiness, there's no need to alchemize it. You know, there's no need to eat it and ingest it and try to turn it into something else. You know, I think that in in the harder spaces, it's sort of our divine job, right? To eat the grief and absorb it and put in our bodies and then try to see what's underneath it, you know, it's sort of like there's always something more there. And I think luckily, whether we mentally know that or not, or maybe it's scientifically in our bodies that the only way we can hold such immense emotions is by working through them because we can't just let them sit there festering, you know. Um, but I do think sometimes real happiness, you know, can have spaces that are in need of alchemy as well.
Hmm.
Because I think that there's tinges of boredom, you know, there's tinges of will I lose this? Do I deserve this? You know, and so I tend to be that weirdo where I'm when I'm in a happy space, I search it, you know. I'm like, where's the alchemy? Where's the alchemy? What do I need to touch, you know? 'Cause there's always something in it. I think it's just maybe potentially less obvious to us, you know?
That's a I think we figured it out.
Okay,
I think
good.
that's it.
Yeah.
I think we
And now
have.
we
That's
just
it.
have to
That's it.
figure out, like, the quantum physics answer that works with it, and then we can write, like, a scientific journal and be done.
That's it. I'm for it. I see a co-write happening. Um, all right, last question. So I've interviewed other actors before. I just interviewed the Wolf Brothers, had
Oh,
them
cool.
on. I've interviewed Kevin Bacon, Jeff Daniels, Josh Radner, and I guess I should say all those people also are songwriters on the side.
Yeah, I know. That's wonderful.
So I'd love to know how your experience as an actor informs your songwriting. If it does, is there any kind of yeah, what's the connection there?
Well, I think it's actually one of the reasons why I first wanted to do it was when I was a teenager, I thought I wanted to be a DP, you know, because I mean, I was an actor, but I also was like, I really love photography, and the DP on sets are like the most like mysterious, sexy, powerful. You know, they command the whole crew, they stage the whole thing, you know, and the camera is such an interesting instrument that when I was about 18, I started, got a little camera and I started editing and I put it in iMovie and, instantly I was like, "Oh, I need sound. I need to I need to go." And so I closed iMovie almost within the first 10 minutes, and I opened up GarageBand, um, and and I started making music in it, very layman's. No one taught me anything. I didn't know anything about music at that point, and it was just like this whole other architecture emerged where I was like, "Oh my god, this is the most risky and, what is the word? Permissive space I've ever been in because not only it's like doing a play as an actor where every night you go up on stage and you build the whole thing yourself, right? You build the roof, you build the plumbing, and then it's gone. The house disappears and you have to go back and rebuild it. In music, it's like you're building the entire house, you know? And not only are you building it, you're getting to choose. Am I a 4-year-old girl? Am I a leaf? Am I an 80-year-old man? You know, I get to I get to sort of be any character I want. And because they're disembodied, it has this archetypical universal, like I can be an 80-year-old man in a song and I will never get to play an 80-year-old man in film, you know? And when I learned that at 18, I was like, this is the most creative thing I could possibly do. And if nothing comes from it, fine, but I want to use it as a risk-taking space. I want to use it to build character. I want to use it to build stories that I can't tell on film, you know? That I will never be cast in, you know? And so I feel like it's been almost like not a rehearsal space because that seems like too small of a word, but it's sort of like my risk space as an actor, when I'm thinking, I'm like, "Oh, I'll never get to play, Count whatever that woman, Count Balzar that was, like, eating women in the, 16th century. They'll never cast me in that. Great. I'm gonna write a story. I'm gonna write a song. I'm gonna build the entire castle in my head, and I'm gonna tell that story, and then I get to be that character, And I just feel like that is so liberating, you know?
And that's it for the latest episode of Songwriters on Process. You can find all of the old episodes on all major streaming platforms and probably some minor ones as well. You can also find them on the Songwriters on Process website. I started the site back in 2011, so that means there are hundreds upon hundreds of interviews with some of the world's best songwriters. So take a deep dive into some of those episodes. They are all great. Of course, I'm biased. Also, shameless plug. My book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, that is me, is out now on Hachette Books and in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend of mine. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God. And so we collaborated on his memoir. I'm biased, but that's a damn good book. Again, it is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir. And lastly, if you want to get in touch, go to the Songwriters on Process website. You can fill out a handy contact form and it'll get to me that way. You can also email me at ben@songwritersonprocess.com. I'm all ears. Send me your comments, your suggestions, your complaints, people you want me to interview. I get great suggestions all the time. I can't respond to all of the emails because I get a lot of them, but I do read all of them. And let me know your thoughts. If you have ideas for people you want me to interview, there's your chance. And with that, I am out. See you next time.